The EU, or having a referendum, will have an effect on the trade through the port of Felixstowe. We'll start to my nearest here. Russell, what do you want to think?
Well, I'm not sure that I think having a referendum would have an effect immediately, but I think, as we've seen with the wider business community, the uncertainty that setting an arbitrary date for a referendum would cause. Last week the boss of Tesco said that he would be opposed to that. So I think there would be perhaps a knock-on effect. Obviously leaving the EU would almost inevitably have an effect on trade through the port of Felixstowe. The honest answer, of course, is nobody knows what that effect would be. But I think that Port of Felixstowe is a completely thriving port. Most of the members of my family work there or have worked there when they were working. And I think, to be honest, there's a lot of things that are wrong with the EU that need to be changed, but I think you change those things better from being in the EU. But I think the trade that we do through the port of Felixstowe is a vital component of our relationship with the EU. I know it's a growing relationship that we've got with Asia and other countries, perhaps even moving away from Europe quite as much as it has been in the past. But I think things seem to be working pretty well at the moment, so I think we should stay the course in the EU. And that's why I agree with Labour and Ed Miliband that we should stay in and we should reform from within rather than setting an arbitrary date or rather than coming out and risking the complete unknown that that would lead to.
Thank you.
Well, I think the EU is our strongest and is our biggest market, and therefore for a port like Felixstowe it's absolutely essential. The alternative, if we were to come out of the EU, as UKIP suggests, what would have to be done would be to have to renegotiate every single trade agreement with every single European country that we get good trade terms on with Europe, and I think that's just not feasible. So when the European elections happened last year, it was estimated at that point that it would cost the region, but exiting the EU would cost the region about 80,000 jobs here across the region. But I'm not going to quote the figures off the top of my head, but there have been estimates about the number of potential loss of jobs within port industries that would be lost from leaving the EU. And the problem with the referendum is, is that it's being pushed in the context of being really opening the door to quitting. That we should get there, that the campaign to get a referendum on the agenda is by people who have an agenda to get us out of the EU. Not to kind of settle the question of whether we're good Europeans or not. And to that settle the question, I think we are good Europeans, but to get us out of the EU. And if we were out of the EU, that would just be enormously damaging to Felixstowe here. Definitely.
Thank you, James.
Just one more example of where the benefits come from the EU is money has been earmarked by the EU to improve the rail link straight from Felixstowe to Nuneaton. There's been, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's been within, I think, something like several billion euros actually has been earmarked for that. So.
About €5 million.
Okay.
Darryl?
So the question was, would leaving the EU affect trade at the port? When, in the short term, possibly. In the long term, very definitely, but in a positive way. You see, the problem is, our membership of the EU ties us to an economic bloc which is not doing very well. Now, Trace will tell you that the Conservatives have created 2 million jobs in the last 5 years. Well done on that. And she'll also tell you that that's more than the whole of the EU put together, which probably tells you all you need to know about their economies. It won't reduce our trade through the port very much, because a lot of that isn't EU trade anyway. The port's Chinese owned. It's not owned by the Germans or the French. It's owned by the Chinese, and that tells you where their focus will be. They're interested in selling their goods to us. We're interested in selling our goods to them. And that's actually what we should really be interested in. And that's the real problem with the EU. When we joined the EU as a trading group, we lost our place at the World Trade Organisation. The seat is dormant. We can take that back up when we leave, and then we can negotiate with all the growing economies in the world, like China, like Brazil, like India. They're the ones that are going to grow international trade over the next 10 and 20 years. And at the moment, some EU commissioner is doing the negotiation on our behalf. Well, I'm sorry. He's trying to look after the interests of the whole of Europe. And you only have to look in the paper to see that the economies of Europe is so diverse. One person could not possibly negotiate on behalf of all of that. And secondly, I'm of the opinion that a British person will be better at negotiating from the British standpoint. So I say, let's get it up. Let's sort the trade out. We can have free trade with lots of places, and in the long term, that's only going to bring economic benefits.
The question was, what would the effect of a referendum be on the Port of Felixstowe? And it might be a slightly adverse effect. I've got mixed feelings about a referendum. The Green Party policy is that we would, in the event of a Conservative government which went ahead with a referendum, we'd back the referendum, and we'd campaign, we would campaign in favour of staying in the European Union. The Green Party is a pro-European party, while we're an internationalist party. Indeed, we are a confederation of international parties. There are Green parties in every country in Europe and beyond Europe as well. So we're very internationalist in our outlook. It's been mentioned, Darryl here mentioned that Europe is an economic bloc, not doing very well. From a Green Party's point of view, we look beyond economics towards environmental issues, and the European Union has done a lot to promote the cause of the environment, well, not just throughout Europe, but in this country as well, and of course in the seas and the oceans, the seas around our coast as well. So from that point of view, we believe it's very, very important that we do remain in the EU. If you're dealing with issues like climate change, pollution, we've recently suffered devastating effects of people suffering from asthma, bronchial conditions, of the pollution that came across Europe. We need to remain in Europe to deal with these kind of situations, which from a solely UK point of view, it would be pretty inadequate trying to deal with it. So the Green Party believes in subsidiarity. In other words, we don't want to be controlled from Europe, but there are some things best handled from a European point of view, other things best handled from a UK point of view, and of course other things locally. But there is a need for each of these tiers, and basically that's the Green Party view on Europe.
I think leaving the EU or having a referendum on it would make very little impact on our own port of Felixstowe, largely because the shipping routes, as Darryl's explained, are from the Far East, and we tend to be the first port of call, and then it goes on to Rotterdam or similar. In fact, it could actually, if we were to leave the EU, it could actually have a marginally beneficial impact. But I think the real question is about whether we want to be the European Union or not, or whether we should have a referendum. It's 40 years ago that people had a chance to have their say. I was 3 at the time. 2 of the candidates here weren't even born. And I think everyone acknowledges that the European Union is significantly different from that time when I expect there are some people in this room who did have a say on whether we're going to stay in the European Union or not. And that's why, I think my name in the front put his hand up. That is why I think it does matter that people are frustrated at being changes. I think the Prime Minister is right that it needs to be renegotiated. I don't have much confidence in what Labour managed to achieve in their 13 years of reform. When they wanted to reform the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, they gave away part of the rebate, and the CAP reform never happened. Meanwhile, I'd like to think that David Cameron has been successful as a coalition government with James's party. We've passed an Act of Parliament, so if there are any further transfer of competences, there will be a referendum. So that's already in the EU Act. And going further, the Prime Minister got us out of the bailout treaty, that basically British taxpayers' money was being used to bail out the Eurozone. He was prepared to veto a treaty that was going to threaten the single market and adversely affect any country that was in the that wasn't in the Eurozone. And I just think he's shown that he's been able to negotiate tough things. Of course, he hasn't got his way on everything. I recognise that. But what I do know he wants to do is to renegotiate elements of welfare, so that when people come from the European Union, and as Darryl said, more jobs than the rest of the European Union put together, so we shouldn't be too surprised if people, in addition to Eastern Europe, from Spain and Italy and Greece have come here, but we want to make sure they come and work and that their wages aren't being topped up unduly by tax credits paid for largely in the past by British taxpayers. So I think it's right that by the end of 2017, I think that's a good time, gives the Prime Minister, if he's re-elected, into that role to have time to go and renegotiate and then put that choice to the British people to make that decision.
Thank you. We'll stick with the economy and ask another question before we invite the floor to either respond or ask some more specific questions. The question is, do you believe the current gap between rich and poor makes for a healthy society? And if not, what will you be doing to change it? And we'll start with Teresa.
Well, in the last 5 years, the gap between the richest and the poorest has come down. And that's largely because you may demur, but that's the facts. The ONF Office for National Statistics will tell you that. And I can see Labour Party members are in denial about it, but that is the facts. But I used to see that across the green benches as well. That said, nobody denies the last 5 years have been easy. They haven't been easy. But the top 1% of earners are now paying just under 30% of income tax. That's more than was happening 5 years ago. When we talk about trying to ensure that people come out of poverty, well, the best way for people to get out of poverty is to have a job. And 2 million jobs have been created since 2010. It's a record on which the coalition is very proud. That's on average 1,000 jobs. And 80% of those jobs are full-time. So it really matters that we do ensure that we have Britain working. The other welfare reform we've done is about you will be better off in work than if you can't work. We've taken major steps to try and break the welfare trap where people will be better off not working or only working a limited number of hours. Now, universal credit, it is complex and we wanted to get it right, unlike the tax credit fiasco, so it is taking time to roll out. But in Felixstowe, universal credit is starting on April the 14th. It started 2 weeks ago, apologies. And that is a gradual rollout, and I think it's right that we do that because we want to ensure that work pays.
The economy does seem to be doing quite well, but nevertheless, in spite of that, the fact is that there are over 1 million people using food banks in this country. There is enough wealth in this country, and the Green Party just basically needs believes that this wealth needs to be redistributed. And I'm aware of the fact, acutely aware of the fact, that people seem to have this impression that Suffolk is a well-to-do place, but I know there's real poverty in parts of rural Suffolk. I know some of my neighbours, people who are just finding it very, very difficult to make ends meet. Teresa talks about helping people who are in work. I'm very, very concerned about those people who can't work, because there are an awful lot of people in our society, elderly disabled, who are not able to work, who may never be able to work, and their benefits have been cut. And I think, quite honestly, that's a scandal. You know, I did bring this up with Dan Poulter, but he seemed to be in denial about it. But I think what's happening to disabled people, and the elderly, quite honestly, I'd like to make the point that and this is one of the reasons why the Green Party has nothing to fear from the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon. I think if only we could bring in the kind of reforms that they've brought in Scotland and provide free social care and health care for the over 65s, I think that would be a wonderful thing. Social care as well as health care. So I believe there's an awful lot that can be done to tackle poverty in this country, and you know, we need some more Green MPs to make it happen.
Thank you, Roderick. Darren?
Well, of course the country's not equal enough. You only have to look around to see people that are really struggling in poverty, and that's not right in this day and age. The country is reasonably wealthy, and we should not allow people to fall through the net in the way that they sometimes do. Now, I mentioned the 2 million jobs number, but there is another number that adds up to 2 million, and that's the immigration number since the Conservatives came in. Mm. And that's an interesting correlation. You can create jobs, but they need to be for the people that are already here. Otherwise, the people that are already here won't be working. I think another problem is that social mobility has ground to a halt. It's at the lowest level, I think, for something like 50 years. And I place blame for that fairly on the education system. We're not actually educating people in such a way that they can move on and get up and give themselves a chance. So there's plenty of stories of people that have started out in very poor conditions, with nothing, no running water. I know that our candidate for Salisbury, he has a picture on the wall of his home. He's got a lovely home now somewhere in the countryside. It's beautiful. He's done very well for himself. But he started in a small farmhouse with no running water. And he keeps that photograph next to his front door because it reminds him every day when he leaves the house, where he came from. So you can do it, but you need the right education, and that's why I'm pleased about our education policies, bringing in back grammar schools and technical colleges so that people actually learn the things they need to learn so they can work. And I'm very pleased that we want to abolish tuition fees on things like mathematics and sciences so that people can go into those knowing that they stand a real chance of making something of themselves. And that's the thing, it's giving people the possibility of making something of themselves, while at the same time ensuring that those that can't, as Roddy said, those people that can't work, those ones that can work, we need to get them working so that we can raise the money to support those that can't. And until we do that, it just won't get any better.
James?
Well, it's not acceptable, the current levels of inequality between rich and poor. And there are various different measurements of this. And as we said, actually look what the ONS statistics say, that there has been a narrowing over the past 5 years, and that also comes out in the DWP below household income survey. But there are lots of different measures, and then on some other measures you look at, you can see that there are some increases in disparities between the different income quintiles. So it all depends on how you measure it, and we can also throw around different statistics on it. But the basic point that was made by the book, The Spirit Level, is that actually societies where the gap is measurably smaller between rich and poor are actually happier societies, more cohesive societies, and actually more productive societies. To me, I've always worked on poverty issues for a long time. I've worked a lot with advice services, and I think one of the important things for people who are struggling with debt, with benefit systems, etc., is they have places to go to for help, such as CABs, and I worked with CABs for years. I think they do a really fantastic job. On the benefits reforms in particular, I think that the move towards the universal credit system, where you aggregate all the benefits as a package, can actually be very helpful to people, and it's being rolled out at the moment. But I also accept that there are other changes to the benefit system which were basically cuts to disability benefits, which were actually cuts that I opposed at the time when they came in, and I think those have been damaging. we do need to do more to address the mortgage gap. How do we do that? Well, I think one of the things that we've done in government is to increase the personal tax allowance, so that if you're on low pay, more people get taken out of the tax system altogether, and we want to get that up to over 12,000 in terms of your initial income that goes tax-free. We want to introduce a series of wealth tax, including specifically a mansion tax that was we first proposed years ago, but then was and now unfortunately the Labour Party also agree with us on this. And I think there were a range of other changes to the tax system which also need to be made to kind of keep on narrowing that gap between rich and poor, as well as continuing to improve the economy, so there are more jobs going around, there is more work going around, more people are in work, and I think the government does have a good record on employment. It is considerably up on where it was in 2010, with the economy now growing again. But there's still a lot of work to do, and there's not going to be any one magic bullet solution that's going to crack poverty. But it's a mixture of all these things, and fair policies and a strong economy. So a strong economy, a fair society, and that's what we as Liberal Democrats stand for. Thank you.
James is the first person to get the slogan from his manifesto in this evening, so well done. I think it depends on what you mean by society. Obviously, Rachel, who's unfortunately not in this evening for the Greens, will tell us at other hustings that other than Portugal, the UK is the most unequal society in Europe. And that should be a national shame. Lots of talk about other measurements that you can use to measure equality, but I'll tell you the measurement I use, and that's walking around Suffolk Coastal talking to people. And when I'm talking to people who use food banks, who are on 0 hours contracts, who are working on the minimum wage, who have been affected by benefit cuts and are paying bounce between job seekers allowance and employment support allowance and backwards and forwards over the course of years, that tells me that we're not as equal a society as we should be. And the only way that you can do that is by trying to create a more equal society. And yes, you do that through education. I'm only standing here today because I was able to continue my education thanks to the education maintenance allowance, which has now been scrapped. And I think that traps people in a place where we don't want them to be. We also have to do something about the wealthiest in society avoiding their tax and evading their tax. It's about £120 billion every year that is evaded and avoided, which should be going to the Treasury. Labour's got a plan to deal with that as well. But the one thing that this coalition government did, which probably made us less equal, is give the top taxpayers their pay cut from 50% to 40%. Labour's going to increase that back up to 50% in our first budget. That money can then be reused to be redistributed across the UK. But also, don't forget, we're not just the UK, even though watching this election you might be surprised to know that. There's also a global society. And as our global society, it becomes ever more unequal. That is driving things like mass migration, the catastrophic effects of climate change. You only have to turn on the news today to see what's happened in Nepal, to see that we are not an equal global society. And that comes into foreign aid, which we might touch on later on perhaps. So I won't go too much into that now, but I think it's really important that we keep a big perspective on what society actually means as we drive forward to try and make us more equal.
So would anyone like to respond or ask for some clarification or a more specific question in this area of the economy? If you could just wait for a mic to arrive, keep your hand up if you want to speak.
I just want to make some points on Port of Felixstowe. I've had dealings with the Port of Felixstowe since 1980, and I'm somewhat stunned by some of the views from the panel to say that leaving the EU would not damage or even improve the situation at the Port of Felixstowe. It will be a shock to the people who work there as well. After all, we're talking about the ships don't just go from China to Britain, there are also feeder ships that go elsewhere. We also cover the Americas as well. There's already been suggestions by some Chinese who think we're leaving the EU and believe that that will jeopardise the trade that we have. There's already companies in this country who are concerned about that. And that itself will affect the import and export trade through the port. And indeed, the question of tariffs then could arise during the whole situation. I think we're burying our heads in the sand if we believe that leaving and the lack of confidence a referendum on the EU would give. I think it would be a tragedy for this town and would have consequences for it. I just want to touch on the question of low pay too. We've seen this vast increase of zero-hours contracts in recent years. A horrendous situation, but it's a disgusting way for people to live. I mean, David Cameron said he couldn't live on zero-hours contracts, but he's done nothing about improving those. But I just want to make this point further. The Port of Felixstowe, upon has been a good employer, which it is, and economically very sound in this country. But we've seen there, with new contracts coming out, you talk about pay, it's not the same as the abject low pay that some people have, but we've seen the lowering of terms and conditions of employment of the people at the Port of Felixstowe. And this is generally happening in many organisations, and I didn't think I'd see that happen. So it's a tragedy, and we're in great danger of affecting this town if those ideas come forth.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else?
This is a more general question, more to do with banking, not that I'm in favour of banks as such, but if the HSBC Bank pulls out of London, will this have a domino effect on banking and reducing the government's purse, or damage the UK economy as a whole?
Okay, would you like to answer that particular question?
Well, from the Green Party's point of view, it wouldn't be a problem. We're basically fed up with seeing these bankers, their enormous bonuses, the profits that they're making. And the Green Party's economic policy is based far more on localism, local banks. We'd like to see more local banks and financial institutions opening up. And the power that the City of London has had, has wielded, has been too much for far too long. And of course, it's happened under Labour, but more so than under the Tories, if anything. So no, as far as we're concerned, it wouldn't be a problem. In fact, as Caroline Lucas said, she'd drive them to the airport.
Anybody else want to comment?
Let me agree with Rodri that Labour didn't do enough to regulate the banks, and on behalf of the Labour Party I apologise, because that was one of the big mistakes we made. We kind of made I describe it as a Faustian pact that we made with the banks, that we would kind of turn a blind eye to what they were doing. They would give us billions of pounds which we needed to invest in public services from the situation we found them in 1997. But specifically on HSBC, my understanding is that their statement was that it was uncertainty over the EU, but then when you dig a little bit deeper, there may be elements of moving elsewhere to pay a lower rate of tax. Now, what I don't think we should do is drive our tax rates down to try and keep them here. I'm not sure I would be driving them to the airport, but I don't think that we need to, stop the world just because HSBC says that they were leaving. After all, there'll be some really prime industrial and office space in Canary Wharf, which I'm sure someone else will snap up. And London property prices being what they are, I bet you get a good deal on them as well.
Anybody else? One more.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons the tax rates are actually going up is because the EU have put them up. So they would sort of, it's a sort of circular argument. Are they leaving because we might leave the EU, or are they leaving because of the EU tax? I don't know. Listen, I don't want to lose any large financial institution. I know they've had their problems and I would like to reform them, but no one wants to see a large business leave London. I want to see London thrive. I think our economy as a whole has become unbalanced, and I would like to see some of that money leave London and come to some of the other parts of the country. It's almost like a separate country in its own right. But they are a big part of our economy, and the tax revenue from London does support a lot of the things that the government does. So it can't be underestimated, the importance. Would HSB leave and be a stampede? I don't think so, because London's still a good place to do business. And they're a global bank. They deal in every country in the world. So, you know, they've got a strategic vision beyond Britain, beyond Europe. You know, they're looking from right above. So I don't think we should read too much into that.
About the port, Lee Ka-shing, who owns the ports, he's shown a big vote of confidence in the UK. He owns the ports, he's invested more money in that. He owns UK Power Networks, the electricity transmission for about a third of the country. And then he's just bought O2. So I don't see this as somebody running away from the UK, perturbed by the current political situation. In terms of the banking situation, Russell referred to it about more regulation. I'm not sure it's about more regulation. I'm always a believer in having effective regulation and that they're taking appropriate steps. When you just cover people with red tape, there is the risk either they get stuck in that kind of a problem or end up ignoring it all. And I think the telltale sign should have been, in a common sense way, when people like Northern Rock were offering 125% mortgages and things like that. That should have been the warning sign. So it is right that the financial regulators learn lessons. We have changed the system. There's no longer what's called a tripartite. There's no 3 bits. It's basically mainly back with the Bank of England now. I think that's the right place to be. But I don't want us to think that taking HSBC to the airport is the right thing to do. HSBC is a global corporation. We should be wanting to keep global corporations in our country where they pay corporation tax on the things that they do to here. I have to admit, I've been a long-standing customer, but I find them, when I was the MP, the most annoying bank at a constituency level. They're not very communicative, and dare I say it, out of the big banks, if they were the ones to go, I wouldn't be quite so crying so much, just because of my personal experiences in that regard. But nevertheless, these are, it is a lot of people work for that bank. If they move their headquarters out of Europe, out of London, out from the principal financial centre for the world, then that actually could start to have a domino effect if we're not careful.
Okay, thank you. You can be brief?
Yeah, well, there was partly the responsibility of the banking sector and the banking system where we got ourselves into such an economic mess. And I think actually the last government was right to bail them out because it had to be done. It has cost the economy a lot. And what they've got to bear in mind is, of course, the government actually owns part of the, Iceland still owns part of the banking sector. And the question, I think, is how do we use that leverage? And I mean, what we've done over the past 5 years is we've separated the investment casino banking side from the retail banking side, and that's actually a firewall that has to be put in to all the banking industries now. And we've also introduced levy on the banking sector, which has also helped bring in more tax revenue. But we should actually use our clout in terms of what the government owns within the banking sector to reform them and to work with them, because I don't think they're going to walk away from the UK, and I think it's just hot air coming out from HSBC.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. And we had a number of questions in relation to the NHS, and particularly one which said, what needs to happen to improve the availability of GPs in Felixstowe?
Politicians don't do anything unless you tell them what to do. I think probably the best way to improve access to GPs in Felixstowe would probably be just to get more GPs. That would seem the most obvious thing to me, but maybe
so how do we do that?
Maybe I'm no. Well, Labour is going to train and recruit 8,000 more GPs as part of our £2.5 billion investment in the NHS, paid for by the mansion tax and a levy on tobacco firms. It seems to me fair that they should pay something towards the NHS. They send a lot of custom its way after all. But there's a more important point here that we've discussed at a previous Hustings. It takes about 8 years to train a GP. So it's not a case that Labour's going to take office on May the 9th and on May the 15th you'll phone up the Grove Medical Practice and you won't be able to move for GPs. So I think what we need to do is actually address some of the problems a bit further up the chain in the NHS. Why are so many people going to their GP when they don't need to? GPs tell me that people go and see them because they've got a cough or a cold. Well, I think we need to educate people a bit more about why they should be going to see the GP, we need to make more use of our pharmacies and that kind of thing. But I think Felixstowe is a growing town, a growing population. We're always being told that we're going to have more houses. So it seems to me that we do need to increase the number of GPs. I don't actually think any party has got the answer to how we do that in the short term. There's a survey recently that suggested a good deal of the current GP population were wanting to retire. So this is obviously something that we're going to have to deal with. And it might even be a case that we might benefit from a little bit more immigration on this point. But I guess we'll come on to immigration later as well. So perhaps we can pick that point up there.
Thank you, Russell. James?
Yeah, well, we haven't put in any kind of targets into our manifesto about we want more, X number of GPs, more GPs by X date, doing X number of hours. Because that's not necessarily realistic. But we have, there's only 10,000 more doctors than there were actually back in 2010 now working in the NHS. But we have a GP crisis which is partly due to older GPs retiring. It's partly due to the increased pressure, demand coming into GP services, and it's partly due to actually medical students find nothing more attractive to kind of work in specialised or hospital settings, medical schools, rather than kind of up sticks, go out to leave your comfortable life in London, go out to Suffolk and work in GP surgery. And we've got to change a lot of the incentives to actually encourage more medics to go out and do things in the community and work in the community, and might be, I think, a lot of reforms needed around that. Not least looking at the whole practice model, I think, because to some people it's kind of unattractive that they have to take on these things of being a partner for the life, for their life, etc. The other thing, is, of course, is about recruiting more foreign doctors into the NHS. I think that can be done, and also about returners, because if you've been in the NHS and you work abroad, and you go and work abroad, and you then try and come back and practice here, the number of hoops and hurdles and so forth you actually have to get through to get back into the medical system here are enormous. That's actually barriers that are put up by the medical professions themselves, and we need to work with the professional bodies to break down some of those barriers. So I don't think there's going to be any one solution, because it does take time to bring people through the medical training system, but we need to look at our whole system of medical training, how we can assist people to get rid and get more GPs back into our NHS. Thank you.
I think this is one of the biggest challenges in the next 5 years, that along with getting high-quality head teachers to come to Suffolk Coastal. I remember one of my very first meetings as MP, very excited, met the Primary Care Trust Board and Chief Exec. And I was so disappointed, disillusioned in a way at the end of that meeting, that this person who was paid £250,000 kind of literally wrung their hands about this problem. And when I said, well, what have you been doing about it? What things? The answer was not forthcoming. And I'm not going to pretend the situation is any better 5 years on. There are more GPs in the NHS, but we do seem to have a challenge recruiting certain kinds of public sector workers to our coast. And it's difficult to understand that. When I ask GPs who have training places, people come and train here when they're at UEA or other local medical schools, why people don't come back. Now, some of it is, to be very blunt, at quite a young age of life, Suffolk Coastal is not quite as exciting as living in Cambridge or Norwich or so on. So there's a bit of that. It's quite expensive if you want to live on the coast. So if you are into sailing or other things, then that's good. But you may need to live a bit inland, a bit like I do, to manage a house on that kind of level. And I think the other challenge is also the GP partnership model, and where people are trying to buy into partnerships. I think that is going to be one of the things that needs to be looked at. I know that doctors themselves are reluctant to change that model. That's how they've kind of invested themselves over the years. But I know at the other end of the constituency in Halesworth, they've been successful by trying to do a bit more about GPs doing research and linking up with hospitals, and perhaps having that attraction. Because there are far more doctors in the NHS than there were 5 years ago, but a lot of them have gone into hospitals, into specialisms. So I think it's about trying to identify at university level, at that kind of post training stage, what is that kind of level of work? And I wish the RCGP would do a little bit more about it. I'd be very interested to know about people having problems with access to GPs, because my experience in this town is that it's one surgery in particular where there is, I won't name it, but nevertheless, I think once people get here, they then tend to stay. So I think it's how do we think about attracting people, because it's not about pay. GPs are some of the best paid professionals in this country, and certainly the highest in the European Union. So I think we need to think, what are the barriers to stopping people come here? I do think a bit of a social life is part of the issue, but it can't all be about that. And I think if I'm re-elected, that will be one of the things I try and get my teeth into in the next 5 years.
I think I can tell Therese what the problem is about retaining doctors, and also she mentioned head teachers, the same thing as well. It just boils down to stress and workload. It's as simple as that. Now, before I go on to talk about that, because I think it's a really important issue, mental health and stress. It's a crisis, actually, in this country, and it's been ignored for far too long. But on the subject of the NHS, I'd just like to say that the Green Party, Caroline Lucas and all of us are totally signed up to the NHS reinstatement bill. The NHS has been eroded by creeping privatisation and PFI. It's been undermining the NHS for far too long. It doesn't work. But and the problem is it's a question of recruitment, of far too many agency staff coming in, doctors not wanting to stay here. My wife works for the NHS in Ipswich Hospital. She's an immigrant, as it happens. So am I, being Welsh. But we're very happy here, and we do our best to contribute. My wife works very hard. She's employed on it's supposed to be a 4-day-a-week contract. She's a clinical cardiologist, so she works long hours, 8 till 6, 4 days a week. But the last few months she's been working 6 days a week. That's how short-staffed they are. And many of the people who trained with her have gone to work in Australia, Canada, other parts of the country, and it's all down to workload and stress. And the fact is, the reason, and there are complicated problems for the health issues that we have in the society, but the reality is that successive governments, both Labour and Tory, for as long as I can remember, because I can't remember any other governments, they have created a sick society. And the answer to, it's not an easy problem to heal a sick society. The Green Party wants to create a healthy society and a healthy world. But the Labour and Tories have created this sick society. It's a society where people don't walk anymore, where children can't play outside their houses for fear of being run over. My neighbours and myself can't walk through the village because we've got juggernauts thundering past at 50 miles an hour. The Conservatives put the speed limit up. There are no bus services. Communities are being broken and fractured because of all the cutbacks in public transport. So there are complicated transport. It's a holistic problem, but it's a really important problem, and it's been created by Labour and Tories, and we really need to create a healthy society. And I'm afraid, in order to do that, we need to go back to the drawing board, and we need some radical answers, and we need a lot of Green politicians to sort it out.
Right, I'm going to start with our manifesto. Because in the manifesto we make a number of promises on the NHS. And the key thing to remember about our promises, because it comes down to the money at the end of the day as to what you can achieve, is that these people, the CEDR, have actually gone through our manifesto. They're an independent think tank policy group, and they work with all the different parties. And they've gone through our manifesto, they've looked at the figures, and they say they add up. What that actually means in sort of layman's terms is that everything that we say we can do, we can pretty much be certain we can deliver it, which is actually a good place to start from, isn't it, from a politician, from when you're voting for a politician, that they can actually deliver what they say they can deliver. So what are we saying? Well, we're saying £3 billion into the NHS, and that would train 8,000 GPs. So it's the same figure as you just said, but 8,000 GPs. But it's also 20,000 nurses and 3,000 midwives. Those are the sort of headline figures of extra staff that we would like to see. I have a problem. I mean, it takes 8 years to train a GP. That's a long time. So whoever gets in on May the 7th, if we recruited all of them on May the 8th, we won't see any benefit for 8 years. So that will be near the end of the Parliament after the next one. And that's a long time. So how do you bridge the gap? Well, it's been mentioned that we could recruit more from overseas. And I haven't got a problem with that, as per se. What I do have a problem with is that all those people that we would recruit from overseas have been trained by their own countries for their own health services. And I think stealing some of their doctors actually shows up the short-sightedness of our own system over the last, well, 8 years, because that's how long it takes to train them. So, how can you justify doing that? So let's look at the other side of the coin. We talked about the supply side and getting more GPs. What about the demand side? What's driving the demand for GP services? Well, Roddy mentioned, or Teresa, I forget which, mentioned people going there when they weren't really all that sick. Well, I think actually most people go there because they either are sick, or elderly people often go there because they're lonely. And they feel cut off from the rest of society, and going to the doctor is something that they can do because they actually get to talk to a human being. And that's not exactly a great advert for society either, if that's the only contact you can have with a fellow human being. So that's one pressure. Another pressure is, of course, immigration, because the population is going up at the size of 3 times the size of Ipswich every year. How can you plan any health system or education system or any other public service if you don't know how many people are actually going to be in your local area? You're going to get positions whereby there is too much pressure on services. It's not a case of not wanting the people or not liking them. It's a case of saying, unless we control the number of people that are actually coming here, we can't control the number of people that are going to be using the system. And until we do that, we can't plan a system. And so the system will always fail, unless you massively overestimate, and no one's suggesting you could ever do that, because you could never afford to. So it's managing supply, it's managing demand, and going forward, we need to think very carefully, because we do need a health service that's properly funded and properly in place, and is there for when people need it. And there are a number of problems with it. And until we start proper reform and getting control of those two variables, it really isn't going to get very much better.
Okay, we'll have one more question about the NHS and then we'll open it to those on the floor. Can the privatisation of NHS services with their need to generate a profit ever be a viable solution for NHS provision? Teresa, would you like to kick us off on that?
I'm always interested when we get asked about privatisation of NHS services. There's no doubt, and you'll have seen this in Felixstowe Community Hospital, Serco was chosen by GPs locally to run the contract for community care. And I trust GPs to make that decision, that they believe the clinical quality that will be given will be the right level of quality that they want for their patients. Now, when it comes to numbers, I think it's about 4 or 5% of NHS provision was given to private companies. I think an additional 1.5% has happened in the last 5 years. Meanwhile, of course, there have been, ever since the NHS started, kind of independent providers. Our GPs themselves are usually independent providers, as indeed are opticians, pharmacists, and so on. So the thing that really matters to me about the NHS is what is best for the patient. And that is what drives all my views about how the NHS should be run. And I believe that's what drives our GPs when they're making those decisions, when they commission care on your behalf. In terms of what David Cameron said 5 years ago, he said he would cut the deficit, not the NHS. That is what he has done. In fact, in the last 5 years, the NHS budget in England's gone up by £7.5 billion, and it so happens both coalition parties have agreed to accept the challenge set by Simon Stevens, who is saying we need another 30 billion by 2020. He thinks he can get 22 billion in savings of that. And we each agreed to find the other 8 billion. Having found the 7.5 billion in the last 5 years, I think we're both confident we can find the 8 billion in the next 5 years. But we do need a strong economy in order to have a strong NHS. No doubt about that. I think the thing that worries me more in the next 5 years, if the Labour government gets in, is it was in December 2013 when the Shadow Health Secretary wrote to the Board of NHS England when they were looking to change their funding formula, or looking at addressing it. Now, when we came into power with the Social Health and Social Care Act, we split out public health from the NHS and we gave that to local councils on the basis that if you have a job and a good house, you're more likely to live longer. And society isn't getting sicker, Roger, it's actually far healthier. Healthier outcomes are happening right across the country. But what happened is that we changed the formula when we were still in control of that to take something a 15% deprivation, we made it 10%, recognising the money that had gone to public health and the funding formula changed. So places where life expectancy was much lower got considerably more money for public health in order to try and tackle those issues. Now the Labour Party wants to reverse that and go back to the old formula, and that would actually mean a cut in funding for Suffolk patients. That is a problem for me. I think it's a problem for patients, and it will make it even harder for some of our services to manage than they do today. The big thing that is changing in terms of the forward view that Simon Stevens wants is that there will be more money going into primary care. That's good news, because I do recognise the pressure. GPs doing more things so that people don't have to travel up to hospitals to do that. But these are the kinds of decisions which I believe that Simon Stevens, who used to be an advisor for the Labour government, I think he's setting out a good plan, and I'm very happy the Conservative Party is backing it.
Well, I think I've already made it clear that we in the Green Party, we're completely opposed to privatisation in the NHS, and it's worth remembering that this process started under the Labour government, so those of you thinking that by voting Labour you can reverse this process, I wouldn't be too sure about that, in spite of what they might say. Therese mentioned the Circle. It's a good example of what happens when private companies move in. Basically, these companies, they're supposed to take the risk, but they're actually finance companies who are just in speculation and financial engineering. I mean, they're in it themselves, basically. And when things start going wrong, when the going gets tough, as with Circle in Hinchingbrook, they just pull out, they just leave it. So, this is not the answer. The NHS needs strong investment. Whether you get it from Labour, I doubt it. But that's what it needs. And just like to reiterate that the Green Party is totally, completely committed to keeping the NHS running as a service. That's what it's meant to be. And the same is true in many other issues, areas of life where we've seen privatisation coming in. I mean, another example is the railways. Again, we're in favour of returning it to public ownership. And I believe it's only through the Green Party actually going to achieve this. So if you want to see if you want to see this sort of thing happening and the NHS really being protected, I would urge you to vote Green in the election.
I don't want to see private companies anywhere near delivering services to patients. Now, I've got a problem actually with private companies maybe driving a van or scrubbing a floor, but there are small contracts organised by the hospital, which is still public. That's just a small contract. It doesn't affect patient care particularly. Patient care is the front line of services, and that should be public, and that's the way it is. Now, the Labour Party with their PFI contracts, they enjoyed those, didn't they? And they spattered them around all over the place. And I was up in Newark for the Newark by-election, and there we learned that Newark was losing its A&E department. And the reason why Newark was losing its A&E department had nothing to do with need. There was the need for an A&E department there. But unfortunately for them, their department was part of Nottingham Trust. The Nottingham Trust were up to their eyeballs in debt because they rebuilt Nottingham Hospital with PFI money. And they couldn't afford to run the A&E in Newark anymore, so they closed it. That is the effects of privatisation on the NHS, and that is why it shouldn't be allowed. Another thing, as we came in tonight, we all passed the 38 degrees people that were stood out front. UKIP would exempt the NHS by name from that treaty, because we don't believe that allowing the NHS to be opened up to privatisation by American companies is the way forward. It just isn't. It should be allowed, but that treaty will, if it goes forward, allow that to happen. Unfortunately.
No, it won't.
Yes, it will.
No, it won't, Darren.
Yes, it will.
It's a complete and utter lie. It's a complete and utter untruth.
Well,
It sincerely says publicly funded health services are not part of that.
there are parts that would be. I'm sorry. Anyway, you can all talk to the 38 Degrees guys, and I'm sure they'll tell you a lot more than one of us know. And another thing, a bit of privatisation through the back door that UKIP would reverse is parking charge at hospitals. We liken this to a sort of sickness tax. So that when you go to hospital and you have to go and see the doctor, you actually get charged to park your car, because quite often using your car to get to hospital is the only sensible option.
Why?
Because quite often, because quite often you're talking about disabled people that need cars. And you're talking about people that aren't very well, that can't travel on public transport.
They should be able to, that's the point.
Well, not if they're not very well, can't. You need to use the most suitable method of transport. Anyway, that's a tax that we would end, because we don't think that's fair. And basically, that's that. We should keep private money as much as possible out of the NHS. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. James?
Well, I certainly think that the NHS should keep a public ethos, but there were lots of claims and counterclaims about privatisation in the system, and there are some places where I think the influence of private companies has gone too far. But it started with the Health and Social Care Act, not the 2012 Social Care Act, the 2003 Health and Social Care Act, introduced by Anna Milburn. That opened the door to private companies coming in and bidding for contracts. What the Health Social Care Act 2012 does, there's very messy legislation, the parts of it I don't think were done terribly well, but things that did were put into it as a result of actually Liberal Democrat interventions and Liberal Democrat changes to the legislation were one, much stronger powers to monitor the regulator, so that the private sector activity within the NHS is much more heavily regulated now than it was before, with much heavier quality checks. And when it comes to bidding, it's written into legislation by Liberal Democrats that the companies need to bid on the basis of quality and not just price. And that was a really important change to get into the Lansley Act, and we got that. And there were other changes which got into the Lansley Act as well, which I think have helped the situation. And so the result is that, as Therese has said, the actual increase in large private company the involvement of the independent and private sector, generally within the healthcare sector, has only increased by 1.5% within the last 5 years. And actually, if you compare it to almost every other continental system, where insurance companies operate quite a lot of the German system, the French system, and they do other. Sometimes look overseas and say, well, they have fantastic healthcare systems there. Actually, the private sector involvement in continental healthcare systems is much more considerable than it is in the UK system, which is basically has been set up and has an ethos of being in the public, of a public sector organisation. But we shouldn't, I think, totally close the door on the idea that any private business or private company can work within the NHS, because what you'd actually be doing is, one, you'd be closing all GP surgeries, because actually GPs are private businesses working within the NHS and contracting within the NHS, and I don't think anyone thinks that's a big good idea. So I just wish we'd get away from the kind of extreme claims and counterclaims about privatisation that go on both sides of this argument. We as Liberal Democrats, what we want to do is totally back the Simon Stevens plan worked up by NHS England, including providing the money that Simon Stevens asked for, which is the 8 billion, because the actual demands on the NHS mean that overall the NHS needs 30 billion more because because the demands on the NHS are not the result of what Rodri has kind of painted as a dystopian, this rather dystopian picture of a sick society. Actually, what the demands are on the NHS is because we have a society that is living longer, people living healthier lives for longer, but living with more long-term conditions as people get older, age-related conditions. And that does put huge extra demands on both NHS and social care, and that is where the big pressure is coming from. But I mean, some politicians once said that the NHS has been like the victim of its own success, and they got panned for it. But I can't remember whether it was a Tory or Labour politician actually said that. But they were actually onto something really, really important point, that the NHS has been a great success, and that is why the demands on it are increasing, because it delivers, and we've got to make sure that it continues to deliver, and that's why we've got to put the funding in that Stevens wants.
Thank you, James.
Well, the original question was about privatisation in the NHS, and you might think it was what was your favourite part of New Labour policy on the NHS, having listened to the answer. Look, Labour Party in the past has made some fantastic improvements in the NHS. We made some mistakes completely. PFI, a complete and utter disaster. Opening up, getting to 4%, I think, of private involvement in the NHS, I think is 4% too high. It has gone up under this government. But the Health and Social Care Act allows for hospitals to have 49% of their beds as private beds in their hospital. And that, private income in your hospital, 49% from private income. Now, it may only be 4, 5, 6%, we can argue about the numbers, but Oliver Letwin, who is the policy chief for the Conservative Party, once wrote a book where he said that after 5 years of a Conservative government, there wouldn't be an NHS left. Dan Hannan, who's a Tory MEP, said that the NHS is like a 60-year mistake in Britain. So, we can all pick different parts of other parties' policies on the NHS that we don't like. But I really think that one of the things we need to do with the NHS is have a long view on it, because, as has already been said, you wouldn't know to look around this room, but we're getting much older as a society. We're living much longer. That is a good thing, but it means that we need more health services. It's all very well to promise lots of money to the NHS, but if you don't know where it's coming from, then it's not a lot of good. It's a bit like me offering you all around the world cruise when all I've got sitting outside is a camper van. It doesn't really make, not really worth anything. So Labour is starting off with this £2.5 billion, which I've already said, but that's fully costed. And once Simon Stevens has told us where the £8 billion is needed to go, then Ed Balls and Ed Miliband and Andy Burnham have already said that we will find the money. Because the NHS is the closest thing that Britain has to a national religion, as someone once famously said. And Labour Party created it, and we had to rescue it in 1997, and we're willing to do whatever it takes again. But on the private contracts that we've got at the moment, I was asked by someone on my way in whether Labour will be able to end them. Unfortunately, we won't, because lots of them have been signed for quite a long time. So we won't be able to just come in and slash all the contracts we've already got, just like we can't do with the railway franchises. But I think what Labour has promised to do is get rid of the Health and Social Care Act, cap the amount of profit that private companies can take from the NHS, and also exempt the NHS from the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And as with so much of Labour's manifesto, I think that's a good start. But I think there's a lot more that we can do, and if I'm your MP, I will press for a lot more to be done to protect our NHS.
Some questions from the floor, so the mic is coming.
Good evening, I'm Stephen Fartwell, I'm a local GP and a trainer of GPs. I'm a little surprised by some of the comments that were made this evening. Many of them were factually very wide of the mark. For a start, it takes 10 years or 11 years to train a GP. 5 or 6 years in medical school, 2 years in pre-registration jobs, and then 3 years on a GP vocational training scheme. So that adds up to 10 or 11 years, and many trainees opt to train part-time because of family commitments, and so it can often be a lot longer. General practice nationally faces a crisis in the next few years in that a third of GPs are due to retire in the next 5 years. Also, 1 in 10 GPs under 40 is thinking of emigrating to Canada, Australia, New Zealand,
Exactly.
because of the bad press that we receive and the fact that we're having so much put on us all the time. Also, people make a mistake of saying there are more GPs. There are more GPs, but there are very few more full-time equivalents. Many of the GPs that are around at the moment are either semi-retired or they're people who finished the GP training scheme and they're then deciding to work part-time. So there are fewer whole-time equivalents working. Also, there's a shortage of community staff in GP areas and things as that. It's said that you don't need to be GP partnerships. The partnership model is a strong one in that it rewards someone who wants to achieve something in the local community, like set up a new premises or something, and it enables the person to do that. And indeed, in order to get finance for it, the finance companies want someone to actually sign up for it. And local GPs have to put their house on the line to get new premises. Also, we've had to face many pointless reorganisations. General practice is a wonderful job that it's a privilege to do, but we do it in the background of lots of meddling by all parties. Serco was not chosen by the local GPs. It was chosen by the PCT, by one very zealous person in the PCT who was not a GP. None of the GPs wanted it locally. We had a contract working for the hospital, and indeed now we have a contract working for Serco, but we did not want that. I think the cleaners are an essential member of the NHS team because they need to be under control so that way you can get infection rates down. It's no good if the cleaner's gone home because their hours have been cut and there's a mess on the floor that needs to be cleaned up. So I think there have been many, many inaccuracies said by all of the members of the panel.
Thank you very much. I would like to support Dr. Felwell, particularly in the appointment of Serco. Serco were appointed by Suffolk NHS, and it only had 2 doctors on that complete board. And they did make that decision on the basis that the bid given to them was a third less than the next lowest bidder. And it would appear that Serco were looking to use us really as their marketing ploy to get into the American market to do a similar thing. Perhaps it's unfortunate for them that they've actually not made the profit they're expecting to do. In fact, they found the contract very difficult to deliver, and it's undoubtedly cost them a lot of money. It may actually be a deterrent to others. But one thing that's very difficult in all of this is that commercial confidentiality keeps the public from actually being able to subject all of these groups to full accountability and transparency. And it's about time, I think, all of you who purport to wish to be MPs made the whole system much more accountable to us, so we actually know what's happening rather than rumour, counter-rumour and the rest. But what I would like to say is that one of the key problems that we have in health, and I say this on the basis of attending PCT and CCG board meetings over the last 12 years, is the fact that we have a block system of payment for primary care, for mental health, for GP services. The only area which actually gets sort of payment by results is the hospital system. So there's been an awful lot of money that's been put into the hospital system to meet your A&E hours or your A&E time frame of less than 4 hours to get down to your 18-week treatment centre. So you've actually had a distortion that's been running now for a very long time, and you've not put enough money into primary care, you've not put enough money into mental health care either. And can you tell me why, with a operating theatre in the Grove Medical Centre, that is not available to the community here to stop them having to travel to either Ipswich or Norfolk, Norwich or Cambridge, when some of the operations that they're having to travel those distances for could be done quite well here safely and comprehensively and save our old folks having to make those journeys.
I think the panel answered their own question as to why we can't get GPs. Because they've made the GP's job too busy commissioning services rather than treating patients. Most GPs don't do 11 years, as we've heard at medical school, to issue contracts. They do it to look after people. And when I go to the GP, I want someone that cares about my health, and is not necessarily a good business person. I'm not interested in their business skills, I'm interested in their medical skills. And that's what we have created by going down this route of making competition and privatisation in the health service. And as for Serco and other companies that just want to cherry pick the easy bits, the ones they can make profit on, we know what happens, we know how they undercut. They cut the wages and the terms and conditions of those that are working for them. And those people, therefore, have to suffer as a result. And what we need instead is a publicly owned, publicly funded, on tax, yes, put up tax, to pay for the NHS. And most people would be willing to pay for that. I can think of plenty of ways to pay for it. For a start, you can start by scrapping Trident.
The only party... Oh, sorry, somebody else can ask a question.
No, you go first, please, and then...
Well, the only party that's actually cut NHS funding in the last 5 years has been the Labour Party, who run the NHS in Wales.
Oh, in Wales.
Okay?
That's
so, it's good. Russell, it's a case of priorities. NHS has been cut in Wales by Labour Party, by the Labour government there. So, Stephen, it's lovely to see you here tonight. I remember when we met, managed to get Paul Watson to come to central surgery, to the Rabbit Warren that you and your staff and patients had to cope with. And from that, I'm working very hard. You work very hard with your practice to manage to get the new growth surgery, and it is a great new facility. In terms of about whether operations can be carried out in the Grove or indeed anywhere else locally, I think that, to be honest, that's got to be a decision for Ipswich Hospital, if that's part of their outpatient services.
And they won't make it.
And if it's a case of if I'm re-elected, I'm happy to follow up on that. I know at the moment they don't necessarily want to do that. I'm sorry if I was wrong about Serco. I was under the impression it was the clinical group of GPs had agreed to that. But nevertheless, Stephen, okay, I accept I'm wrong on that. But they will be deciding the next community care contract. And going back to the point at the back, actually, it's Dr. McKee from the Walton Surgery as part of the CCG. Some GPs do want to be involved in making that decision on who's going to help treat their patients. I think that's a good thing. The same is true of, I think they're the best people judged to make that clinical decision. They have other people doing the bits and numbers and stuff, but they have to make that choice. So, you know, the thing about the Felixstowe health economy, we have got this brand new surgery, partly also helped by the sale of the Bartlett Hospital, which closed in 2006 and had been sitting there for some time because it was no longer fit for 21st century care, is my understanding, and that decision was made a while ago. But we managed to, I certainly lobbied hard to ensure that most of the proceeds of sale of the Bartlett went to help pay for the growth surgery. And it allowed the GPs to sell their central surgery site to Wetherspoons. So, you know, this is a case of using different parts of the NHS to try and treat people closer to home. I agree with you on that. The Felixstowe Community Hospital does a great job of that. It doesn't matter whether it says Serco or something else. I know the staff and nurses work hard there in order to ensure that they give the best care they can, treatment they can to Felixstowe patients.
Was there somebody back there on my left? And then we'll move on.
Hello, I've been nursing for 35 years as a trained nurse. And what I don't see addressed is the huge amount of wastage. I mean, there's different computer programs come along, the appliancing, food, lighting, There's not a nationalised type equipment, so there's all different types of equipment, often not working as well as they should. And it just seems that things are always coming from the top. Rather, I've worked in private for a short time, and they're much more on the ball with things like that. I mean, I'll give you an example of working on a ward and seeing a docket signed for a simple frame to hold disposable gloves. It cost £159 just to put this thing on the wall. Now, I mean, nobody in their right mind in their own home is going to pay that amount of money. So there seems to be a huge amount of money going where in actual fact could be saved for the benefit of the public and more healthcare workers.
Okay, I guess that's perhaps part of the 22 billion that's going to be found somehow. I think we should move on, otherwise we're going to...
Can I respond on these issues that we raised?
No, we'll move on.
Well, if we haven't been...
We'll move on. We'll move on. The UK has now become the first G7 country to meet a 45-year-old target to commit 0.7% of GDP to international aid, something of which the author of this question believes we should be proud of. Are you convinced of that? Are you going to continue to fund that amount, and how do we best ensure that we use it effectively? Russell, you want to start?
Yes, I'm incredibly proud that we've enshrined 0.7% in law, and I'm even more proud that more Labour MPs than any other political party voted to put that bill through. It's just a shame that we didn't do it in our 13 years, but it's good that it's there now. I think overseas aid is one of the most things that I look forward to my tax-paying money going to. Someone came up to me on Tuesday night, and I can see him here again tonight, who said that he'd never met someone before who enjoyed paying tax. I enjoy paying tax because we need to pay tax for our society, and I think...
How much additional tax do you pay voluntarily?
You don't pay tax voluntarily. Well, I buy lots of things, so I pay VAT. That's voluntary.
Do you pay additional tax voluntarily if someone will take it off you?
Yes.
Send a check in.
Have you set that up for them?
I can't quite clear the debt that Theresa's party were racking up, unfortunately. 0.7%, that's 70 pence for every £100. You see what that is doing around the world. 45 million children in Africa educated in the last 10 years, just through the British overseas aid programme. Tens of millions of lives saved through immunisation programmes. That is something that we should be proud of, because these are our fellow human beings, and they are often living in the poorest and most underdeveloped societies in the world. Now, moving forward, I think we are going to have to give more, because the developing countries of the world are facing some pretty big challenges, whether that's through climate change in countries like Bangladesh, who have played no part in creating the climate change that they're suffering from. There's also countries that are at risk from natural phenomena like typhoons, which we saw last year, and even Nepal with the earthquake recently. So I think 0.7 is a good base, and I think we should keep it as our base. But yes, I think we always need to be ready to give more. I was incredibly pleased that Ed Miliband said today that the Labour Party, if in government, will do whatever Nepal needs, because they are our fellow human beings, our fellow citizens, and as I said earlier on, this is part of playing our role in a responsible global society, and I think that's really important.
Well, it was actually a Liberal Democrat MP, Michael Moore. It was his Liberal Democrat, it was his bill that was passed with government support that enshrined the 0.7% into law, which was an aspiration going back to the Millennium Goals back in 2000, and I'm very proud of it that we've done that. The important thing to note is that it is a floor and not a ceiling. I certainly do think we should do more in international aid, but do it in the right way. And so what we need to be, the projects we need to be investing in through DFID are projects that help make local economies self-sustainable. And to address one projects that also have the potential to reduce tensions and reduce conflict where there are conflict areas in the world. And as I think when you'll find, I have a different view from this from when you go on to Darrell, because his party want to cut foreign aid, but it's strangely inconsistent because the more that you can actually do in international development work to make economies self-sustaining, reduce levels of conflict, then actually the less kind of problem migrant refugee flows you get in.
Yes.
Right, am I proud of the fact that we spend 0.7% of our GNP on overseas aid? Well, not when we've got pensioners that went cold this winter, or not when we've got children in our own country that are living in poverty, and not when we've got people that are surviving on food banks, and not when we've had a 200% increase in tuition fees, and not when we've just been talking about an £8 billion back hole in the NHS. No. I think charity should actually start at home. Would you like to know where your 0.7% went? I've got a couple of examples here. We gave £4 million to the Ethiopian equivalent of the Spice Girls. We tried to create 29,000 jobs in Sierra Leone and actually managed to create 16. And then we gave £60 million to the Congo Police Force, and then a year later, they did a survey and found that they'd actually become more corrupt as a result. So, I'm not particularly proud of that record of achievement. What I want to see is the aid budget cut, but I want to see what's left of it focused on what actually matters. So it is immunisation and it is disaster relief. And in my view, we should actually be the first country there on the ground in Nepal. That's actually something that we're very good at. We have the technology, we have the facilities, we're very good at sending helicopters to places and picking people up. We're very good at supplying tents and clean water in those sorts of situations, and that's what we need to focus on, because that's when people really need us. I'll pick up James on his point about people wanting to migrate. Well, there's 2 points to that. Our plan is trade rather than aid, because if you trade with people, their economies get better, their economies get stronger. So they have no reason to want to migrate anywhere. And we do that outside of the EU because we'll be much freer to do it, because the EU actually stops us from doing that. And the other thing is, when we look at the Mediterranean at the moment, if we hadn't bombed Libya, do you think they'd all be in boats trying to come over here? No, it's not all about aid. There's a lot of things. We've got it wrong a lot of times, and it needs to be changed.
Well, I pretty well disagree with most of what Darrell has said. Most, but perhaps not all. I completely disagree with this idea of charity beginning at home. I think we're all human beings. We share one planet, and I think we have a moral responsibility to look after each other. As I'm sure you're aware, in the short to medium term, the Green Party advocates spending more on overseas aid. However, I'd like to point out that in our manifesto, as a long-term aspiration, our goal is to spend less on aid and to focus that onto disaster relief rather than giving aid, which the reason for this is because we see it as, or it can be seen as, the wrong sort of something left over from the Victorian era, a sort of colonial, paternalistic process of propping up and helping people when it would be better to help them build sustainable societies to look after themselves. So that's the long-term aspiration. And I know many charities. I was at the Red Cross last week in Ipswich. This is exactly what they do. So it's not just a question of giving people handouts, it's a question of helping them to help themselves so that they can have a sustainable society, stand on their own 2 feet, and have the same kind of privileges that we have in Northern Europe. But this is a long-term goal. But I really need to make the point as well that climate change is, of course, a big factor in many of the problems in the countries that require aid. And although we want to build this sustainable, healthy society, not just here in Britain, but all over the world, because we're a global organisation, the Green Party. We're a federation of Green Parties all around the world. So that's our long-term goal. But nevertheless, because of the catastrophe of climate change that's facing us, the money that would go onto overseas aid needs to be earmarked and set aside for the kind of inundations, floods that we're starting to see already on this coast, because what we've seen so far is going to be nothing compared to what's going to hit us later on. So we really need to get our armed forces can play a part in this as well, in helping to step in when the kind of disasters that climate change is going to unleash all over the world. When these things hit, we really need to be prepared for that.
For those who may not be aware, the government today has released £5 million cash to help in the Nepal situation, £2 million directly to the Red Cross and £3 million to partner charities already on the ground. So your taxpayers' money is being used right now to help people in Nepal. Before I became an MP, I used to speak for a charity called WaterAid. It's one of my biggest things that I continue to do in Parliament is to push this whole thing about Millennium Development Goals, but in particular that. I'd rather spend money ensuring that everybody in the world has access to clean water, sanitation, hygiene education, than to frankly send a rocket to Mars. Never, both are, of course, are valid things to do. However, I want to just make it clear, we reached the 0.7% a couple of years ago, and I think the British public should be proud of that. I tried to persuade both Save the Children and indeed my own government to do a bit more about when the income tax statements start to come out, to try and translate for people of your tax bill this year, £25 went into international development. That is the equivalent of buying 5 malaria nets, which now means persons less likely to contract, or something like that, to try and get across in a straightforward way how your taxes are helping some of the poorest people in the world. That could be immunisations, it could be about children going to school. Some of it is about basic human relationship. We are the 6th largest economy in the world. We do have a seat at the UN Security Council, which is one of the reasons why, if we get onto defence, I think we still need to keep trident. But also being part of that UN Security Council, I'm very happy the United Kingdom takes some moral leadership in also addressing some of the causes of poverty and some of the causes of instability around the world. And aid is one of the ways to do that. So I'm very pleased our country was the first to reach it, and I hope more do. Moving forward, one of the reforms we did was to ensure that we had a lot more regular reviews of how money was being used. I do think it's right that some of this money has to go to governments to help in their civic governance. You've got to start trusting people spending money. I know it can be difficult at times when you then start to read about, in your newspaper, about some scandalous use of that. But actually, a lot of the money is being targeted through partner agencies, also in trying to help small, micro-level businesses as well. So there's a multi-layered approach on how to improve the lot of people in some of the poorest parts of the world. That still includes India. No, we're not giving money to the Indian government to fund their space program. We are targeting aid on India nowadays to the poorest regions, which between them comprise half the number of the poorest people in the world. So it is focused much better. We no longer give money to Russia, we no longer give money to China. Quite right too.
Let's have a question which returns us to a more local issue. What will you be doing to increase the supply of affordable housing and social housing, particularly for our young people? Russell.
I wondered how long it would be until we had the housing question. Well, we've got in this region, the eastern region, about 29,000 empty homes and 26,000 second homes. Now, the reason I say that is because I think that we could be doing a lot more to bring those 29,000 empty homes back into use. And if landlords want to sit there and not have them used and sit there empty, then perhaps there should be a role for the councils or the government to compulsory purchase them and bring them into the social sector. I also think that we could be doing more to ensure that our second homeowners contribute to building houses going forward. I've advocated at previous meetings some kind of annual levy or annual payment that second homeowners would have to pay, which would then be specifically used by the local authority to build more affordable housing. Now, Suffolk Coastal District Council doesn't actually own any properties. Waveney owns some, which covers the north part of our constituency, and in fact in Southwold, last Sunday I saw them building some council houses, which was a complete novelty, although Labour in Ipswich have just built some, so that's good news. But also we need to look at what is affordable, because different people have different definitions of what affordable is. There's a flat that went on the market in London recently which was marked as affordable, which was £650,000. Now, someone might be able to afford that, but I'm damn sure I can't. The issue is, you need to build houses that the community needs. Up in Woodbridge and other parts of the constituency, 3 and 4 and 5 bedroom executive houses with massive driveways and big gardens are not necessarily what we need in Felixstowe. In an ageing society, an ageing town, we need to be looking at more sheltered accommodation, more perhaps retirement areas, such as my great nan used to live in at Marjorie Girling down in Old Felixstowe, and the other one in Larkhill Way by I nearly said Safeways, by Morrison's, showing my age. We also need to be building more 1 and 2 bedrooms, because my generation and generations to come are living longer before they start a family, so they don't necessarily want to move in to a house. But it's undisputable that we need more investment, and I think the government has a role to play in that. And that's why I'm a bit concerned with the policy that the Conservatives are espousing at the moment about selling off housing association stock through the right to buy. Because the lesson of right to buy of council houses was, yes, it's good that people who live in the council houses to be able to buy, but something like 40% of ex-council house properties are now in the hands of private landlords. Yep. And that's driving up rents, and that is pushing house prices, and it affects a whole generation. But Ed Miliband announced today, which I'm sure you all read in your Sunday Mirror, that Labour is going to bring in rent controls, and we're going to give more secure tenancies. So we do need to look after the rental sector as well, but it is absolutely vital that we get Britain building again.
Well, I find this time I actually agree with quite a lot of what Russell's just said. I think we have a national housing crisis, both nationally but also in Felixstowe as well. And the solutions that are coming forward aren't always the right ones. So here in Felixstowe, there are a lot of developments up around Gulfo that are being discussed or pushed through planning stages that are about producing more executive-style housing around the perimeter of Felixstowe, whereas what we need are, for the kind of demographic we've got in Felixstowe and the kind of workers we need in Felixstowe are a mixture of, well, certainly within the town, more flats available for particularly younger people and younger families, and also rather than the sort of rather obscene development of luxury retirement places, we need more sheltered housing for people in Felixstowe as well, like the fantastic sheltered housing behind St John's, which is very attractive, which is a very attractive sheltered housing place. But and some of the housing we're seeing is just like on the South Sea front. It's just doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite fit in, and we need to find housing that fits in with Felixstowe, and where it becomes impossible to cram more housing around within Felixstowe, then we need to look outside Felixstowe. Nick Clegg is very keen on the idea of garden cities, actually creating new communities, our whole communities, that aren't just kind of commuter belt communities, but are the communities themselves, and Mike Mingley here has championed the idea of a possible new village in St Mary's within the Felixstowe Peninsula, and that'd be a good thing to pursue. But the problem, one of the reasons that this has become such a difficult issue in Suffolk Coastal is because even though the District Council has its development plan, what it hasn't really done is produce a coherent land release strategy, which partly I understand has been held up by all the issues about the industrial park and the legal case about it, but they have really dragged their heels on this. And it's only if you have that land release strategy that you can plan where the new houses are going to go. And then within that, it's really important that communities themselves produce their own neighbourhood plans so that they can shape their own style of development that's suitable for their communities. And so far, Brentford's done that, 1 or 2 other communities are doing that, but the District Council needs to give more support for communities to produce their own development plans.
Yes, well, I think Felixstowe probably has enough houses. It's just being used in the wrong way. As we've heard that a number of them are empty and a number of them are second homes, and that's not actually really beneficial for the people that actually want to live here 12 months of the year. So I think that needs to be addressed. It's interesting, a lot of local government district councils are actually starting to build council houses, and there's a reason for that. Their grant from central government has been squeezed, and what they found is that by building council houses they actually get a revenue, and obviously that revenue can then support services, so they're actually sort of slowly moving back to that idea. And I actually welcome that, although they've been forced to do it because of their financing, but I actually welcome that. I have an issue with rent controls because I think it won't work. It'll have the opposite effect to the one that Ed Miliband would really like. The first problem, of course, is a bit like the energy companies. Just before it came in, they'd all hike their rents. So you can all look forward to much higher rents in the run-up to any such law coming in, because they will try and make as much as they can beforehand. The second thing is it will actually reduce availability, because people will take houses out of the rental sector because they can't make the money on it. So it's a double-edged sword, and it really isn't a ground you want to get into, because it will actually reduce rather than increase affordable housing, I fear. Well, both James and Russell were right about the types of houses that we need to build. We need more bungalows, in my view, more flats, and more smaller places, partly to cope with more people living alone, and more and in their older age, people living alone because one of the partners has passed away, and so on. And those places need to be secure and right for those people in their later years, so they should be accessible, and we need to make more progress on that. The UKIP development strategy is, of course, brownfield first. Yep. And we would get the Environment Agency to draw up a list of brownfield sites across the country. We believe that there's enough brownfield land in the whole of the UK to build 2.5 million houses. We want to deliver 1 million of those by 2025. And we do that with things such as grants to help clear up the land and abolishing stamp duty on their first sale. So actually incentivising people to put houses in the right places, effectively. And we'd also introduce a statutory duty on local government to charge empty houses at 150% council tax. So thereby sort of waking those owners up and saying, look, you need to actually do something about this and make this house is not back into use. And I think this overall is a sensible way forward. We need to use what we've got, only a lot more sensibly.
Whenever this issue comes up, there always seems to be quite a lot of consensus between the people from the different parties, because we're all agreed on the need not to build on greenfield and to build on brownfield sites. I'd like to make the point that the Green Party has been very vocal in opposing the National Planning Policy Framework, also known as the, well, we call it Developers Charter, because it's been instrumental in bringing these enormous applications in for places like Framlingham and well, other parts of the county around towns. But so that's something which has been quite disastrous, really. So we'd like to see that abolished. But I agree with a lot of what Russell has been saying. Compulsory purchase on empty homes. Also, I disagree with Darryl here about rented properties. The Green Party wants to introduce a rent cap and longer tenancies to give more security for private tenants. This may surprise you to hear, but because a lot of silly things have been said about the Green Party and the royal family, but I'm actually a bit of a fan of Prince Charles. He's the stand he's taken on against genetically modified crops and organic farming, and also his housing development, his community in Poundbury is something that it would be nice to see being emulated in other towns and cities. And the interesting thing about that is it combines quite compact houses and workplaces to build real communities that function, because that's important. If you're going to have a sustainable society where people don't have to commute long distances, you need workplaces, workshops near where people live. I'd like to see that sort of thing happening in and around Felixstowe. I'm a little bit worried about the proposed garden village, is it, for St Mary's? Anything that involves building on green fields, the Green Party is totally opposed to. Well, we wouldn't be the Green Party, would we, otherwise? So, as other speakers have said, there's an abundance of brownfield sites around this country. Between 1.5 million homes can be built on brownfield land. We're a small island, we have a growing population, and we need every bit of agricultural land we can keep hold of in order to feed that population. So that is something, as far as the Green Party is concerned, that has to be protected at all costs.
The biggest source of demand for additional housing, it tends to be family breakdown, and also the fact that people are living longer and staying in their own homes. Yep. 5 years ago, we scrapped something called the Regional Spatial Strategy, where in the past it was the east of England needed so many houses, and there's some deals done somewhere, and Suffolk Coast got told how many they were having. We got rid of that. It so happens, in the end, we've actually ended up with the same number in the process of agreeing it with the local planning inspectorate. But nevertheless, the principle was about passing to the district council the responsibility to provide accommodation for now and the future, for the kind of the needs that our local area has. The National Planning, the NPPF, I think was a good thing in terms of its simplification, taking about 2,000 pages of planning guidance down to about 54 or so. There have been some additions to it about reinvigorating the guidelines on certain aspects, and particularly rural development. But nevertheless, it took away things like a requirement to how many parking spaces any particular development had to have, and regulations like that, and entrusted councils to be able to make that kind of common sense decision. Now, locally, I get the feeling our councillors have a better view of how many parking spaces a particular housing estate might need rather than somebody in London. Anyway, going further, how do we help people with housing? Well, we've done some things. We've done the thing about help to buy, so it now extends to anybody trying to buy a house. It's not just first-time buyers anymore, about helping people with access to certain elements of finance. We're also helping people save for a deposit, so that's good news. We've got our particular ISA starting to come through later this year. We're also doing an element of 20%, reducing the cost of housing by 20%, so that first-time buyers under the age of 40 makes it cheaper for them, what we're calling starter homes, to get on the housing ladder. Now, what's been said already is actually quite right. We introduced about using empty homes more. There are already powers councils can use if they want to go and get homes that have been empty for some time. I'm not saying it's straightforward for them to use it, but if they really want to, the councils can already do that. I think some of the more subtle changes we've introduced, like there are no discounts on council tax anymore for second homeowners, but we've also increased for empty homes. Council tax, I think after about 2 or 3 months, if it's not being used, that can now be levied at 150%. And there have been various changes, and the reality is that Suffolk Coastal ended up getting more revenue in as a consequence of those changes. Because it is levying those charges, and that is stimulating people to bring those properties back into use. Flagship probably being the #1 example of that. I remember a few years ago when my local councillors were complaining about the new housing bonus, and part of the issue were these empty homes. So we started saying, well, where is this the problem? What are your officers doing about it? And #1 was Flagship. And in particular, it was the development at the end of, I'm in brain freeze now, Taunton Road, Exeter Road. Do you know where I mean? That's where Comfort House and other things are just laying empty for some time. And the first residents have been decanted out, as the phrase is used, 10 years earlier, and have been sitting empty for about 3 years. Now, to their credit, Flagship got a bit of a kick from me and a bit of encouragement. Knocked down those houses, and now there are fantastic new homes there, including homes especially adapted for people with disability. So, you know, some good has come out of the policy about stimulating that. Need to go further, need to do more. I'm very much in favour of trying to reduce the amount of additional development happening east of the A12. The local plan is already bringing many houses to Felixstowe and Trimley area, and indeed there. In the latest consultation, I said, well, let's have a bit more west of the A12, frankly, given that 40% of this constituency is in the AONB, and there's a lot of pressure on that. So I'm not in favour of the St Mary's Village, as it's been called, the bit beyond the Grove. I don't think we need that, certainly now. I'd like to say, I hope we need it never. But I'm very keen that we ensure to keep a strategic barrier between Felixstowe, the Trimleys and Ipswich, and that's why I'm completely opposed to Trinity plans to develop Innocents Farm and similar as well. So we need the greenfields, we need those lungs, and it is one of the reasons why people move to Felixstowe, because you get the best of both worlds, including beautiful countryside.
Hello, and here we are at the Hustings in the Salvation Army. Now this is the second of the Hustings, and this is the first night that Dr. Coffey has been with us. She is the present MP, as you know. She's done magnificent service for Felixstowe, and I'm so proud to have her with me here tonight. Now hello to you, and tell me, the first thing is, what is the main thing you think you've done in the last 5 years?
Oh gosh, it's hard to pick that out. A number of things. I think the A14 toll probably stands out as being the public achievement, but I'm very proud of the work we've done about elements about the ambulance service. It's not fixed yet, but at least there's a recognition that patients out on the peninsula matter and shouldn't be driven just by targets. We need to make sure the patients are put first.
Well, they're very positive things, Felix. Yeah. A14, well, I mean, you know what that means to us.
Yeah.
Now, what is the main thing that you've got in mind, and why do you think you're the best person to represent us now in Parliament?
I'd like to think my track record is that being able to help people in Felixstowe, being able to help the port, being able to help other businesses in order to continue to make this a great place to live and work. I mean, it can still do more, I'm not denying that, and I hope that some of the work I've done recently about the Seafront Summit, getting people like Premier Ian involved, there's some good work going on, and sometimes it needs a bit of knitting together, and I think the MP, I think I've been able to help some of that.
That's terrific. Now, I didn't realise that you were involved with Premier Ian, so that's wonderful.
Well, that was more about bringing them to the table to have a discussion about how to improve the Felixstowe tourism offer.
Well, that's fine. Now, unfortunately, time is short, but as MP, what do you think is the main fault with Felixstowe at the present moment? What is wrong with Felixstowe?
I don't think there is anything wrong with Felixstowe. I think actually Hamilton Road suffered the economic recession problems really rather well. I would suggest that we just need to continue to have confidence in ourselves and continue to maximise the most of what is the great potential here.
And finally, just to finish, do you think the Conservatives are going to win this election?
I think they are. I think we are, I should say.
Yes.
I really hope that we do. I genuinely don't want the 5 years of hard work. You know, it hasn't been easy for people. I think that's been quite difficult, and I think that they need to, I hope people realise that a lot of that could be ruined by the party that, how can I put it, got in the mess in the first place.
Well, Henry, you've put up a great performance tonight. We're very grateful to you.
Thank you very much.
For Felixstowe for the last 5 years.
And lovely to speak to Felixstowe TV again.
Jolly good. Well, there you are. That's the end of that, and hopefully good luck to everybody involved.